Welcome to the Frontline Herbalism podcast with your host Nicole Rose from the Solidarity Apothecary. This is your place for all things plants and liberation. Let's get started.
Hello, welcome back to the Frontline Herbalism podcast. So this is the third episode in a mini series all about different nervous system states and a kind of herb that has an affinity for that, for kind of shifting that state. Please, if you haven't, check out the introduction episode because I talk about like a bunch of the nuances, like that, these states aren't a binary, they aren't like good or bad. They've evolved for a fucking reason. And I also talk about how, a lot of people, probably the majority, to be honest, of the planet are in proper survival states. So, these nervous system states are serving their kind of evolutionary function of keeping people alive while under threat from all of the fucking things. But I talk about how when these states get kind of stuck, that's when we're in trouble in terms of like needing support to kind of shift them back to, how we want to be feeling, which is potentially in a more sort of safe and social state where we feel grounded and connected to our bodies, being able to socialize and interact with other people in like non-threatening ways, and where we can access feelings of joy and aliveness, and also, like clear, kind of grounded, strategic thinking. Okay, so this episode is about the shutdown state. So shutdown from an evolutionary perspective, commonly comes after being in fight or flight. And it makes sense because it's like our body's way of like preserving energy. So in nature, it might look like an animal playing dead. Not that humans aren't nature, but you know what I mean. So when this response kind of gets sort of stuck, it can show up as like regular feelings of helplessness, emptiness, hollowness, isolation, numbness, feeling drained. And, it's often accompanied by like kind of a lot of like fatigue and depression. And in general, like the world can feel very, very overwhelming, but also like overwhelming, but not in a like hyper stimulating way, but in a real like life is fucking pointless and uninteresting. And like in that kind of way, if that makes sense. So some of the like embodied habits that might accompany this state are like withdrawing or isolating yourself, wanting to kind of be a hermit, wanting to hide away from the world, limpness or fatigue. So I'm going to talk about freeze in the next episode, which is often a state of real kind of like tension, whereas shutdown, it's more of a like a limpness. So someone might be sort of lying like motionless or struggling to get up. There's often a lot of kind of like dissociation, like a feeling of kind of like checking out almost of the body. And it's often accompanied by kind of brain fog and like mental heaviness. And, it's really the body's like last line of defense, and it's a way of conserving energy. It's so hard because we're always like a dance between all of these states. So you might hit a real serious like shutdown phase where you are sort of shut down for like several months or, even years potentially as like your dominant state. Or it might be that you've had a really hardcore week with loads of stress, and then you have like a day where you're feeling more shut down and you're feeling like extremely fatigued and helpless, and like everything is uninteresting and you don't want to get out of bed. And like that often correlates with like low sort of cortisol reserves when the body's already been just like generating huge amounts of stress hormones, for a long time. So it's it can be like a real long-term pattern, or it can be a short-term pattern, just something that kind of moves in and out. I guess like a couple of examples, just like content warning here, when I know I've talked about his death several times, but when my friend Taylor killed himself in prison, the subsequent weeks were just full of hardcore rage and activation and anger and like extreme fight or flight. Like I also got COVID, but I was dealing with the authorities and fighting the prison and trying to get information and trying to get his body and trying to get his stuff and it was so stressful. And then it was like, once the funeral had happened, I was fucked. Like, I think it was maybe 3 weeks where I really couldn't get out of bed. Like, I in all honesty, I just felt like I kind of wanted to die. Like, I just wanted to lie in a room and not do anything. Maybe I was like watching trash, but often I was just lying there for hours, like proper zoning out. And, you know, like I saw this pattern. For example, my mum, who's amazing, had quite like severe depression when I was a child. And yeah, one of her sort of critical kind of nervous breakdowns when I was about 11 years old came after, you know, months of really fucking intense stress, of moving to a different place, of having a relationship breakdown, of having like loads of economic challenges. And then bang, it just like the body didn't have the reserves to be in that fight or flight state. And so came the kind of like, will not get out of a darkened room for love nor money kind of phase, you know? So yeah, it's a really challenging state. But again, all of these states have evolved to protect us. And when someone is like out of energy, like it really makes sense that the body initiates fatigue, right? Because that body does not want to use any more energy anymore and needs to like protect and safeguard itself. And we often, you know, this kicks in when it's like feeling impossible to like fight or flee, for example. So how do we move out of shutdown? And again, that's like a whole book's worth of content, but like you can't push through it because the capacity to push is fucking gone. So it has to be gentle. It has to be slow steps, you know? Like when I had like a really bad PTSD episode, which I've talked about before as well, but like it was literally like write a post-it note the night before of what I needed to do in the morning. And it was like brush teeth, have a shower, go sit on the bench near my herb garden. And that was it. Those were like my 3 outcomes for the day that I was trying to achieve each day. And, you know, like, yeah, it's all about gentleness, basically. So, you know, that gentleness, it might be, say for the example of after you've had like some really hardcore stress and you're feeling like shut down kind of temporarily, but you just don't want to get out of bed. Like sometimes just don't get out of bed. Do you know what I mean? Just, if you can, just cozy up with a duvet and hot drinks and watch trash and dissociate, or just lie there feeling fucking hopeless, you know, because your body is trying to preserve your energy, and hopefully your energy will return gently. And often it's very hard to shift out of this state like on your own. Like normally the state, you need someone to kind of like, I hate the term co-regulate, but like it really helps having someone there to like enhance that feeling of safety and to kind of like gently move you out of that state. Because, you know, like slow movement is like really fantastic if it's possible, you know, like maybe stretching or just like walking very gently. You know, it's not like, oh, I've got depression, I'm going to go for a hardcore run. It's just not that. It's very, very gentle, you know, like a warm bath or maybe some lavender oil, or like, yeah, connecting with plants. And I think, you know, or animals, for example, or just sitting with the land. Like you don't have to be like, I'm going to go do these 5 billion things for like my quote unquote mental health. It can just be like, I am just going to sit here and watch the birds and the insects and the plants. And that can be enough to help someone slowly over time, like shift out of this state. But like I said, you know, it's like a whole spectrum of a state. But yeah, the plant medicine that I've included in the series for this state is St. John's wort. So yeah, just I guess safety note, St. John's wort speeds up the kind of metabolism, like the processing of things in the liver. So it has vast impacts on pretty much any pharmaceutical medication that you're taking. There's also some research. It's a little bit inconclusive, but I have heard anecdotally about St. John's wort affecting contraceptives, for example. But I basically think if you're taking anything at the same time as St. John's wort, it will potentially like speed up that clearance of it in your system. So please research like it thoroughly before using St. John's wort. But yeah, it's such a fucking incredible herb. And I love working with St. John's wort with depression. And it's not because of this like generic antidepressant action, which has been like very well researched and documented in all sorts of like placebo, you know, double-blind controlled trials and stuff, like against meds like Prozac. Like it's really strongly effective. But the mechanisms of that are also very interesting. So St. John's wort has this amazing affinity with the liver, hence, this effect on taking medications and them, being cleared faster. But the liver is like such a critical organ in terms of processing our kind of like wastes in our system and our metabolites and our hormones and our stress hormones especially. So St. John's wort has a real affinity with people who have self-described kind of like stagnant depression, where depression is coming from a liver that is potentially not functioning very well. And so, St. John's wort is like, fantastic at helping that kind of organ to process, if that makes sense. And therefore, that can have a knock-on effect on, all our kind of endocrine system and our nervous system. But it has this real amazing kind of like uplifting effect that I think there's not loads of herbs in my experience that really do that as well as St. John's wort. And I think when someone is in a kind of like frozen or shut down state, you do need that kind of like joyful reminder of how it feels to have a kind of lifted mood. And St. John's wort is also fantastic with kind of like repair. So it's like a really amazing like wound healing plant because it's fantastic at kind of accelerating the like the regrowth in healthy tissue, for example. And it's really great for like intestinal permeability, which is kind of colloquially known as leaky gut. But I will often use, if someone's not on meds, I'll use a bit of St. John's wort as part of a kind of gut heal tea to help kind of tone and heal those like inflamed like gut tissues, where there might be some intestinal permeability. And there's just like a fucking mega field of interesting stuff around someone's gut health and their mood. And so working with St. John's wort is really amazing because we're kind of like covering our bases, if that makes sense. Like we're supporting the liver, but we're also supporting the digestion and the whole nervous system in terms of kind of like, shifting that kind of like, that low mood. So I think St. John's wort is fantastic when someone is in the state. And all right. So again, shameless plug, the Herbalism PTSD and Traumatic Stress course is still open until Monday. So if you want to join it, please fucking join it. You can listen to a bunch of other podcasts where I'm talking about the course in depth. I'm talking about the modules, the lessons, like the learning outcomes. I'm talking about the sliding scale and how it's no one turned away for lack of funds. So please, please, please don't go onto that course page and think, shit, I can't afford that, because there's so many fucking options. You can just access it for free with the code and all the details are on the page. Or you can be like, right, I'm going to donate £3 a month. Or you can be like, right, I can afford this, but it will take me 5 months, in which case there's a payment plan. So just like, please don't delay accessing support for yourself. And it is lifetime access. So there's no pressure to participate in it now. Like there's no live calls or anything like that. It's all kind of content that you can work through completely in your own time. And I send out email reminders like in an automated fashion every 8 weeks. I mean, I'm Aquarius, like everything is fucking automated. No, I'm just joking. I wish it was. No, I'm just joking. Anyway, basically I've tried to make it as accessible as possible. And there's 32 plant profiles in there about herbs like St. John's wort and their support for the nervous system. So please check it out. And I will be back soon with the next in the series. Okay, take care.
Thanks so much for listening to the Frontline Herbalism podcast. You can find the transcript, the links, all the resources from the show at solidarityApothecary.org/podcast.